Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations as the traditional owners in the land on which we meet today. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. I'm not sure where everybody is tuning in from, but maybe it would be kind of timely just to take a moment to think about on whose land you're kind of sitting on today, particularly for those people online. Yes, I think that's something else I wanted to know as well. I think when we're talking about violence and care, thinking about the presentation last night, it's quite important to think about processes of colonization, the violence and the harm, and that's particularly an ongoing situation kind of here in Australia, and something that is going to very much inform some of the presentations today, I imagine, in sort of different ways. So I guess before we begin, I would just like to mention that Guy Aitchison has sent through an apology for today. Unfortunately, they're unwell, and kind of staying up until 2 a.m. in the UK was a bit beyond it, but they very complimentary about their fellow panelists and would like to they said that they would get in touch with people, and also welcome anybody to follow up with them if they were interested to hear more about their work on immigration, detention and induced self-violence. Okay. So I said yes to chairing the panel last night, so it's a bit rough. So I'm sort of just catching up on things at the moment. So we've got 3 panelists today, so 2 in person, and so we've got Sarah online. So we've got a little bit of time, so I don't know what everybody is thinking, but what would be useful? Like, I think, should we just sort of try and keep the presentations to sort of 15 minutes to 5 minutes of questioning and questions, and then maybe at the end have a sort of an open discussion about sort of maybe similarities and differences across papers? Would that sort of?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah. Okay. All right. We'll do that. Bree is going to do the timing today, but I guess we don't have to be too harsh. Last time I was giving a presentation, I ran over someone that had a bat, and it was like 2 minutes, and then it was like and they switched it around, and it was like red stop, and I was like, oh my god, that's quite brutal. So we are a little bit flexible today. So we'll start with Raffaella Cresciani's paper today on Beyond Domestic Binaries, Mapping Violence and Carcerality Across Disability Homes. So I'll pass over to Raffaella.
Hello, can everyone hear on Zoom? All right. All right. Thanks for coming to my talk. It's great to see everyone, and thank you for to everyone on Zoom. My name is Raffaella, and I'm a PhD candidate in criminology here at the University of Melbourne. I'd like to firstly acknowledge that I live and work on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. In this talk, I center the home, and I'd like to acknowledge that many Indigenous people with disability are regularly taken from their homes and their countries and are placed in a range of carceral sites. And that settler colonialism more broadly is, as Hagar Kotef argues, an act of living inside someone else's home, a home that has been destroyed. My presentation today draws from a chapter of my PhD research, which looks at violence against disabled people in the home through a new materialist lens. And what I want to explore in this talk is how a range of homes for disabled people become sites of confinement through the entanglements of human and non-human agencies. We'll get to all that later if that's a bit confusing for now. So in terms of the structure of the organization, of the presentation, I'm firstly going to set up how criminology and disability studies have tended to understand the home. I'm then going to talk a little bit about new materialism, the home, and confinement, before turning to some of the research materials from my PhD, so my interviews and things like that, to explore how everyday, pretty ordinary objects and spaces contribute to the confinement of disabled people to domestic space. So disabled people live in an array of dwellings, in family homes, individual homes, mental health hospitals, group homes, social housing, nursing homes, and a range of other institutional and personal settings. Critical disability studies has often thought of these homes in quite a binarized way, along the lines of personal institutional homes, public and private, and so on. So the institutional home is sometimes framed as one of increased surveillance, restriction, and restraint, and reduced opportunity for resistance by disabled people. The personal home is often understood, conversely, as a place where relations between able-bodied people and disabled people are less constrained. So Davison, Rowe, and Campbell highlight that criminology has also tended to approach the home through a set of binaries, like, so for example, as private, public, safe, unsafe, feminine, masculine. And Campbell also highlights that a lot of criminological literature has thought about the home as kind of a static, bounded spatial entity, one that is kind of closed off and isolated and disconnected from broader political, cultural, and capital flows. So in my presentation, I want to complicate some of these binary understandings of the home by showing how entanglements of human and non-human agencies render the homes of disabled people in their many forms sites of restraint and confinement. So specifically, I want to show how seemingly small or seemingly innocuous material objects contribute to confinement. I don't deny that there are significant differences between different home sites, different forms of the home, but I just wish to show how a broader array of homes become sites of confinement than solely those deemed institutional, than solely the ones that we might typically think of as sites of confinement in disability studies. So what do I mean by entanglements of human and non-human agencies? How do objects and spaces contribute to the confinement of disabled people? And more broadly, what does new materialism offer an analysis of confinement, disability, and the domestic? So new materialism is an emerging way of thinking in the social sciences and humanities, and is part of a broader material turn that's taking place within these and other fields. So new materialism troubles a range of binaries around, including those around nature, culture, human, non-human, language, matter, and many more. And neat distinctions and clear categories are complicated in this literature. So for these reasons, new materialism helps us to disrupt the binary thinking of the home that I outlined earlier. For example, a divide of institutional or individual disability home is diluted by the fact that disabled residents in personal homes receive regular visits from a range of institutional figures. It might be support workers, cleaners, allied health professionals, nurses, and other staff that they might employ. People with disability in personal homes might also experience a lack of privacy and elevated levels of surveillance by their family. And conversely, group homes and other residential settings sometimes become spaces of intimacy and familiarity, where consensual sexual relations might be formed between residents and where individuals who live together over many decades might develop familial bonds. So rather than assuming a priori that the personal and the institutional are essentially different, new materialism kind of encourages us to look at how confinement works in any given location and kind of across locations. New materialism, as the name suggests, also encourages us to consider the material when thinking about the social world. So in relation to carcerality or confinement, it pushes us to think not only about the policies, procedures, human-to-human encounters and interactions within carceral settings, but it also encourages us to think about how confinement is enacted by and with the more than human material world. So new materialism views the material world as having no permanent essence. Nothing is static. Everything is undergoing constant change. So that means that what an object is or what it can do will depend on what happens when it's kind of connected or plugged into other material things or other bodies. So for example, a chair could be multiple things. It could be something to sit on, like we're all doing now. It could be chopped up and burnt to make firewood if it's, made of wood or something combustible. It can become a weapon if you throw it across the room. So depending on the chair's entanglements with other objects, a body that needs to rest and sit down, an axe and a flame, or flesh to bruise and injure, the chair changes. It takes on different capacities and it fulfills different purposes. So new materialism also views the material world as having agency, as being able to act in the world. So sometimes objects and spaces agencies are intertwined with human agencies, and sometimes they're not. So by viewing confinement as something that non-human objects and spaces contribute to, we see how a broader array of places can become sites of confinement, not only those that are set up with human intentions to segregate or to institutionalize. So I want to now explore some of these ideas and give some examples to help make all that a bit more concrete. So I want to firstly consider objects and their capacities to confine through an exploration of Pamela's story. So Pamela is a disabled self-advocate who lives in social housing in Melbourne and who uses a wheelchair. She has a daughter, and when we had our interview, she was just about to go on her first ever holiday up to Queensland. So in our interview, Pamela told me, I actually had a delivery yesterday. I heard the delivery guy, it was my daughter's pull-ups, and they come in big boxes. When I opened the door, he had jammed them against the wire door. I had no way of getting out of my own home. I had to call a friend. So here, Pamela was temporarily, her home was temporarily made a site of confinement through a delivery package being left angled against her wire door. So with this action, there wasn't necessarily any human intent to confine or to incarcerate her. The delivery driver, didn't necessarily want that to happen. But nonetheless, the box acts as a blockage or a lock that kind of confined Pamela to her home, a lock that she is unable to unlock. So the delivery parcel was a large, angled, sturdy cardboard box, something that, is typically used to ease transport of multiple items. In this case, it was nappies, is transformed into an implement of harm or an implement of incarceration when it is enmeshed with the wire door and the low center of gravity of Pamela's body as she sits in the wheelchair. So where a lot of disabled people are socially isolated, Pamela had a friend that she could call to help move the box, to unlock the lock, so to speak, and to end her period of confinement. Disabled people are also confined to specific areas or activities within their homes through their interactions with material elements. So Sarah Hamoud was a young disabled person who lived in residential care, and she died of septicemia in 2016. At night, Sarah would often fall out of her bed, and a community visitor who is like a volunteer who visits disability residential services to kind of report on them and observe what's happening in there and I guess, make notes if they think that things that are happening there are kind of dodgy, said that months after an assessment, Sarah was still waiting for a high-low bed with a crash mat. Because there was only one person working at night, Sarah or Miss Hamoud would be made comfortable on the floor until another staff member arrived in the morning. So Sarah was routinely confined to the floor of her room due to an entanglement of human and non-human agencies. So decisions surrounding staff scheduling meant that only one staff member was rostered on at night, and Sarah couldn't therefore be lifted back into bed after she had fallen out. The residential service hadn't ordered an appropriate bed with a crash mat in adequate time. And the floor, a cold, hard surface, one which permits lying horizontally like a bed, but doesn't afford the softness, warmth, comfort or support that we would want in a bed, kind of became a holding zone until the morning. So in the global north, the floor is typically where our feet make contact with the earth. However, the rest of our body is normally supported by chairs and beds when we seek rest. It's quite rare that non-disabled adults would rest their entire bodies on the ground. The floor is thus used perversely here. Its intended function as a smooth, flat surface that we can travel on is distorted. It's rendered harmful in its transformation into a space of constraint. Thanks. Non-human elements outside the home also work to confine people with disability to domestic space, rendering binaries of inside and outside increasingly fuzzy. So Josh was an advocate I spoke to who works at a deafblind organization, and he told me that 87% of the members of the organization, so that's disabled members of the organization, said that physical hazards in their neighborhood were the #1 thing stopping them from being involved in their local community. Josh said it tends to be seemingly innocuous things like loose pets, like pets not on a lead, overhanging tree branches, sidewalks and stuff that are in poor condition. So here it's not elements inside the home that make the home a place of confinement, but as Josh says, innocuous non-human elements in the broader community that work to isolate people to their homes. So for deaf-blind people, so people who are both deaf and blind, having maintained and predictable spaces is crucial in being able to navigate the world safely and crucial in being able to leave the home. Sarah Ahmed highlights that yeah, thanks. Highlights that maintenance work might be necessary for a path to be usable. That tree that fell over might need to be moved, that rubble pushed to one side, those prickly thorns cut back. We can think of this maintenance as care. To keep something usable requires taking care. What Josh's statement shows is that this care for the non-human world is routinely neglected, and that care for the non-human is intimately bound to the flourishing of disabled people. When footpaths are cracked or when branches poke out, public space becomes less usable for certain bodies. Inside and outside, public and private are blurred, and a lack of care in one space shows up as confinement to another. What I have aimed to do in this presentation is to show how a range of domestic spaces can be made sites of confinement through the entangled agencies of everyday, pretty ordinary objects, spaces, and practices of the home. I hope with these ideas to contribute to a criminology of the domestic and to encourage further consideration on the ways that seemingly small, innocuous actions and actants accumulate and can cause harm to disabled people. The chapter that this presentation is based off is still under construction. So yeah, any questions or thoughts you have, I'd really appreciate. And yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you for that interesting presentation. So I think, is there Well, does anyone have any questions, Raffaella, and are there any online? I think there seems to be a few comments.
There were just, right on schedule. There were just some questions about the slides. I think there was a tech issue with how they were presented. Would you be happy if we email them or circulate them?
Yeah, of course. Oh no, that's a shame.
Yeah, I'm going to the chat if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
So does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask? I was really interested in this idea about, I guess, like carelessness or non-care and how that would contribute to, I guess, the confinement of people and bodies in, within the home. I guess how, what my question would be. So how, like when you're thinking about sort of like this kind of carelessness and violence, I guess there's sort of that, it's more sort of unintended violence. Is that sort of what you're trying to sort of?
Sometimes, yeah.
Sometimes, yeah. And what would be the other times that you would? Yeah.
Of intended violence?
Yeah, I guess, or sometimes in terms of the carelessness, like I think, or non-care and sort of producing kind of this kind of violence. Is limiting kind of the movement of people, confining them to the floor.
Yes. Yeah, sure. I think that's a really good question. An interesting thought. I think if we think about, the example of the cardboard box and how that confined Pamela to her home, we might say that delivery driver wasn't, intentionally causing harm, but his, I guess, lack of care works to confine Pamela to the home, and in like not as an individual, but in the sense that as a society we don't consider, accessibility, and we don't think about the ways that these seemingly small actions can really harm someone and keep them confined. So I think like we think of care or not lack of, I guess we think of care as an intentional thing, and lack of care as unintentional. And I think broader systems of ableism contribute to that. They contribute to us not thinking about these issues and not considering how these seemingly small lack of actions or misuse of things can kind of contribute to confinement. So sorry, I feel like that's not is that what you're kind of getting at?
No, definitely.
Okay.
And just thinking about, I guess I'm not so familiar with new materialism kind of work, and just sort of trying to think through, and the work that the frameworks I often work at feminist ethics of care, and so so thinking about, when we think about the word, care is just like an essential part of, I guess, the human world, like the interactions, and sort of one of the sort of approaches of, live in the world as well as possible for everybody.
Yes, yeah.
And so, it means kind of caring and being careful.
Yes, being careful.
All of those sorts of things.
Yeah, I think care is really tricky in disability studies, because I'm sure as other presentations in this conference will talk about, is, care is often weaponized against disabled people and used in ways that are paternalistic and contribute to confinement. So I guess in this talk, I'm kind of thinking about how care for the non-human can simultaneously be care for disabled people, but not in that paternalistic kind of direct framework of,
like that intentional care that can actually, be an intervention. It can be violent.
Yes.
It can be restrictive, all of those sorts of things.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, and I guess within the feminist ethics of care, it's more around that we are all embedded in relationships, and that produces the kind of worlds that we live in. So
Yeah, and I think new materialism would have a lot in common with that, but yeah, extend that to yeah. I think there's.
Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, so online. I'll put online. Cool. Hey, what's up online? With that, like non-intentional lack of care, like, do you think, or do you discuss, or acknowledge that there's a class-based element to that, depending on the geography of where you live, and that actually that's like an inherent part of like the capitalist system, right? So if you're poor, you live in a shittier neighborhood, then there's going to be cracks. So therefore your surroundings are like more confining.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's so important. I think disabled people in Australia and many other places are, like, I hate to use deficit statistics, but are more than likely to be living under the poverty line. Most of the people who I spoke to lived in social housing that wasn't kept up to date and wasn't cared, like the housing wasn't cared for. And I think that a lot of these like the cracks in the footpath, the branches not being cut back, all those things are totally intertwined with class and with the resources that the government is willing to allocate to certain areas. I think that these issues that I've talked about would be quite representative of a lot of people with disability who like the housing market is really messed up. Like, so much of it is not accessible. Rentals are so expensive. There's very few places that disabled people can live safely, and if it's not institutions, it's social housing that's not kept up, or inaccessible private rentals. So it's totally intertwined with all those issues you mentioned.
Yeah, I think we'll good questions, but I might just sorry. Yes, but maybe I'll just go to Ebony is it Ebony online, and then to Pan. Is that okay? So Ebony, would you like to actually ask the question, or would you like me to read it out? What's your preference? I'll read it out. Okay. So what the question is, how the interview participants themselves saw these events that sort of impinged kind of on their, I guess limited their movement or restricted them to the floor. And so sort of what was the sort of their interpretation, I guess, is sort of what's being asked of the event that sort of saw them confined or limited.
Yeah, thanks, Ebony, and hello. It varied. So Pamela's story about the delivery package actually came up really randomly because we were doing a Zoom interview and I got a delivery, and so she heard my intercom go, and then we were just talking about, like, it was in lockdown. So we were talking about, being at home and lockdown and being on Zoom and all that. And then so she kind of just randomly brought this story up. I didn't ask anything about it. And I don't know if she would have brought it up if I had asked, like, later in the interview when I did ask about her home. She didn't reference it again. So I think for her, it wasn't necessarily, a super, I guess, she made the point that she was locked in her home the whole day. But I guess because she had people she could call to leave, it wasn't perhaps viewed as seriously as some of the other forms of confinement that I talked about. I think Josh's interview, where he said that most of the people at the organization he works at, can't leave their home because the material surroundings are so poorly kept. I think that was a much heavier thing for those people, and it really restricted what they can do. And I guess that's also where class and stuff intersects, because Pamela had a lot of support. She was on the NDIS and she could go on holiday, so she had a certain level of mobility. She could drive, whereas I think for other people who have less support, less connections, less material resources, that confinement and the weight of being not able to go into the community was much heavier. So it really depended on the I guess social position and privilege of the person that I interviewed. That kind of shaped how they perceived it.
Ebony took my question,
Oh,
but I
okay.
had a second follow-up question. Were you thinking about objects and sort of the non-human stuff first, or and then you found new materialism, or were you like, how did you come to new materialism to kind of understand that sort of, because the framing I think is really interesting and I'd like to hear.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think when I started my PhD, I had never heard of new materialism. So it definitely wasn't something that I knew about or was interested in. Well, I think I was interested in, but I didn't have a label for it. I think the thing that I really enjoy about critical disability studies is, Dan Goodley talks about disability shows us what we value. It shows us how we imagine what the human is, and it shows us, I guess, how we live our lives. And so I think when I was thinking about what is the human, and how does disability both challenge and make us rethink that in a creative and really affirmative way, that's kind of where I started. I think my supervisor was like, oh, you should read The Post-Human, right, by Rosie Braidotti. So I think I started that, and then it really clicked. And then Dan Goodley's another scholar that I really like, and he works a lot with new materialism and post-humanism and uses that to inform the way he understands disability. So I think I kind of fell into it a little bit, but I think those interests were always there in an organic way.
Okay, are we probably? Sorry. We probably should keep moving. But thank you, Raffaella. That was a great, really interesting presentation. So I'd like to introduce Karanikolas, who is going to present on the treatment is looking too much like punishment. So are there any other questions? We've got 30 minutes left, so maybe we'll invite Sarah to speak. And Sarah is going to be presenting on classes. I turned 43 a couple of weeks ago, and now I'm like, maybe this is when it all shifts. Sarah is going to be presenting on reforming immigration detention in Canada and the United Kingdom, learning from critical prison studies and abolitionist perspectives.
Great. Thank you very much, Nicholas. Hello, everyone. It's really nice to be here. So I am Sarah Turnbull. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Legal Studies. And I'm joining you. I work at the University of Waterloo, so I'm in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. So I live and I work and I play on the traditional territories of the Arawanaran, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. And the University of Waterloo, as well as where I live in Waterloo, is situated on the Haldimand Tract, which is land promised to 6 nations and includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. Settler colonial processes are ongoing on these lands. And I think in the context of migration and the other presentations today, particularly around reform and other reforms that are going on both in Canada and the United Kingdom and other countries, just the importance of bringing a decolonial perspective to this work. That's something I endeavor to do in my own learning and my research and my teaching. So the work that I'm presenting today tries to bring together a couple different projects, which hopefully is not too annoying for everyone attending today. So really is a kind of trying to think through how the present governmental focus on carceral reform and immigration detention kind of come together. So I've been working on it for a few years, trying to get a paper out that looks at the concept of vulnerability and how that has been kind of taken up in efforts to reform immigration detention in the UK. And I've started a new project on Canada that's trying to understand, reform efforts here that started in about 2016 through the National Immigration Detention Framework, and trying to really, use these as opportunities to think through and engage critically how ideas around detention are kind of created, the ways in which immigration detention gets framed by different parties, how it gets justified, and then kind of ultimately how it gets reproduced, and then maybe how we can, work to reduce that likelihood that detention kind of keeps proliferating. And then the second kind of purpose really is to try to underscore some of the work by critical scholars who are looking at penal or carceral reform, and trying to bring this in conversation with the scholarship on immigration detention, and then how we might maybe envision some new possibilities for a world that doesn't rely so heavily on immigration detention. So very much works in progress. Very happy to hear any thoughts and feedback. So some of the key questions I'm asking sort of in these two projects. So trying to think through, the ways in which problems with detention and, related solutions that are identified and applied, where do these come from? How do they get articulated? How are they justified? Trying to think through, using genealogical methods to think through, the social institutional practices that produce the National Immigration Detention Framework in Canada, and different related reform processes, such as, the pursuit of alternatives to detention. The second question I'm trying to ask is, how do these intersections of race, gender, class, sexuality, and other social relations of power work to shape policies and practices of detention, as well as what we might envision as alternatives, and then various reform efforts that are going into, making detention better for people who are detained, and then also efforts to working towards abolition. So part of this is addressing, shortcomings I see in my own work that, where I haven't really adequately tried to work through, how intersecting inequalities, as well as historical and institutional oppressions, work to reproduce and produce detention in particular ways. So trying to do a bit more work for myself on that. And then thirdly, really trying to get to this issue of vulnerability, kind of catchphrase in a lot of governmental discourses. So, can we figure out a way to talk about, vulnerability as a human condition or a social condition in relation to detention that doesn't work to, recreate fairly problematic racialized and gendered categories of detainees who are sort of seen as less or more deserving of confinement, or maybe more resilient to confinement. So I'm particularly interested in how ideas around vulnerability get understood and then produced as an object of knowledge and then action. And with the goal of kind of thinking through how we can collectively address vulnerabilities without perpetuating divisive politics or framings that harm, that can be very harmful for particular groups. So some of this really is building on insights of studies of penal reform. There's an abundance of cautionary tales that think critically about reform, a quote here by Bree Carlton, in which she says, reform as an antidote to the overuse of prison, and particularly through its more radical iterations as reductionist in providing alternatives to institutional punishment, is the simultaneous proliferation of imprisonment, and along with its profound social and economic costs. So there's a lot of scholarship, activist, evidence that really shows, the challenges of doing reform work, and in particular how, state power is quite successful at rearticulating and reassembling in the face of change, and often doing so along racialized, gendered, classed, ableist, and heteronormative lines. So a lot of lessons here, a lot of, lessons about reform, in particular the paradoxical position of penal or cultural reform, and how it works to expand rather than reduce imprisonment. So we know, following scholars like Liat Ben Moshe, that it's not as simple as equating institutional closures or releases from incarceration as, quote, freedom, particularly because community spaces can be carceral and surveillant as well. So I think back to David Rothman's observation that, from his 1980 book, that conscience or rehabilitation and convenience, which he talks about as imprisonment, were incompatible. And, there's a lot of power of carceral systems that really ensure that, convenience is what's reproduced. So I think I see this as a lesson about the limits of reform and the challenges of doing differently. So a lot of learning and a lot of critical work, I think, is really important as a kind of thought process for thinking through what has, worked or not worked in the past, and how do really problematic systems get kind of continually reproduced. So Ben Moshe argues that it's important to keep in mind the difference, tension, and relation between reform and abolition efforts. So one of the main tasks in these projects is trying to consider the question that Ben Moshe articulates based on Angela Davis's work, which is what kinds of reforms are sought and will they strengthen the systems in the long run. So again, this is not an argument that, it's reforms that helping people shouldn't be made, but really thinking through, what kinds of changes are people asking for, what are the kind of potential consequences of that, and how it may differentially impact particular groups of people. So just a quick overview of the case studies at hand, just trying to keep it brief in terms of just for time. So I've done work in both Canada and the UK. And, I started working in the UK in 2013. And over that time, I saw a lot of reform efforts. At present, the kind of numbers of detention centers kind of keep shifting if we include, these asylum camps that have been created. But the number of detention centers or immigration removal centers has been, kind of consistent around maybe 7. When I first started work, there were, I think 13, so the numbers really decreased. In the UK, it's a very heavily privatized system. The numbers have dropped with COVID, but still a lot of people who are being detained at any one time. The UK, like Canada, does detain kids. Most detainees, the people who are detained, are male. Canada is also, like the UK, both countries practice indefinite detention. Most people aren't held that long, but there are kind of the more problematic cases are people that have complex immigration histories that can be detained for long periods of time. And a slight difference between Canada and the UK is UK doesn't have a statutory review process. So people who are detained rely on judicial reviews, whereas Canada has a detention review process, which is not perfect, but does sort of, according to law and policy, provide for reviews at certain periods of time. Canada has 3 immigration holding centers, and people who are not detained in one of those 3 centers are detained in a provincial prison under immigration powers. There's much less private involvement in Canada, a much smaller detention estate. So a daily average in Canada would be 133 people. And kids are still detained. And Canada, as I mentioned, is also an indefinite detainer. So some of these reform efforts, I've sort of touched upon it, is the changing detention estate. So, there's been a number of centers that have closed, some have been sort of repurposed, some kind of closed and then open. We see more recently the creation of camps for asylum seekers based on channel crossings. So a lot of sort of shifting of the detention estate itself. The second kind of feature I want to draw attention to is the ton of lobbying, activist work, publishing reports, parliamentary inquiries, investigations, and so forth in the last 10 years, where a lot of groups have, this hashtag time for time limit. So really pushing towards the end of immigration detention, of indefinite immigration detention as one way to start reducing the harms of detention. So there's been, calls for like a 90-day time limit. And, there's been some kind of policy changes in response to that. But really just a lot of work. And then secondly, and relatedly to the kind of advocacy and lobbying and, report writing, inquiry, et cetera, that type of work, there's been this increased focus on this group of vulnerable detainees. This group typically includes children, pregnant women, elderly people, people who are torture or rape survivors, people that have existing physical or mental health issues. And the Home Office released an adults at risk policy that was trying to reduce the number of people, so-called vulnerable people in detention, but that's been sort of heavily critiqued for not being very effective. And a lot of the work has been focused on Yarlswood Immigration Removal Center, which is the detention center that was for women. And particularly a lot of critique that, this detention center is detaining women who have survived gender-based violence. And there's also been investigations into sexual abuse by guards against detainees at that detention center. So it's quite a notorious detention center. Canada, just really briefly, I mentioned the National Immigration Detention Framework. So this came with an investment of nearly 140 million Canadian dollars over 5 years. Part of this was for infrastructure and upgrading the 3 immigration holding centers. Part of this was, to reduce the reliance on provincial prisons for detainees, immigration detainees, and improve their conditions of confinement. There's also this expanded alternatives to detention program. It's been done primarily through a risk-based community case management system, and where detainees are, required to report or kind of be monitored through electronic or voice surveillance mechanisms. And then just lastly, just to quickly kind of finish the case study here is, the National Immigration Detention Framework is also concerned with vulnerable detainees. And it defines vulnerable detainees as people for whom detention may cause a particular hardship, but includes pregnant women and nursing women, people under the age of 18, people that have severe medical conditions or disabilities, victims of torture or human trafficking, and so forth. So some similarities and some differences. So one of the, I think, interesting things to think through is, the ways in which alternatives to detention often get sold as a panacea, as a sort of easy solution to detention. But many scholars have talked about the ways that, and I know some panelists here have mentioned it already, that, the community does have a carceral character for many people, that we can't, easily equate being, released from immigration detention with that kind of freedom. The community, can have a lot of carceral or penal, experiences or you know, ways of controlling people through electronic monitoring or reporting, other mechanisms. And then part of this is also thinking through what do we mean by vulnerability? And Anderson and colleagues, you know, have been really critical with the notion of, you know, vulnerability or protection, that, you know, the state becomes seen as the, you know, the solution, that the state can provide and protect people who are vulnerable. And, you know, part of this paper is arguing how we constitute a vulnerable detainee, you know, relies on gendered and racialized and classed ideas about who is vulnerable. It links, you know, to ideas around deservingness, and how we can, you know, really think through the way that we make up, you know, this vulnerable detainee, kind of in Ian Hacking's way of making up subjects, and do so in a way that doesn't, you know, normalize the detention of other groups of people who might be seen as, you know, not vulnerable to detention, or more, quote, resilient. So really trying to think through, you know, how the state produces these harms, produces these vulnerabilities, and is probably not, you know, the best protector for the people it's detaining. Another task then is trying to situate detention and reforms within a broader scope. So critical scholars like Jenna Lloyd have argued that, you know, we need to draw connections between practices of border control and the carceral state. Think of these as, you know, global, not within the confines of the nation state. Trying to bring detention into, you know, both in relation to broader domestic carceral practices, as well as to, you know, what she terms global apartheid. So try to think through those systems of power, privilege, you know, that produce and sustain inequalities. Do I still have another minute? Am I okay?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Just to conclude, so part of the work, what I'm trying to do with these projects is to think of detention in relation to carceral abolition and systemic inequalities that are both at global and domestic scales. And really, I'm trying to think through, you know, the limits of vulnerability as a kind of concept or a strategy of reform, you know, that is trying to do some good work of addressing, you know, the differences that people share, but also tends to individualize them, view them as, you know, individual problems that people have. You know, either they go into detention and, you know, they're considered vulnerable, or, you know, there's not enough recognition of the way that detention itself exacerbates, and that, you know, poor physical health, poor mental health, and that these should be understood as structural and systemic. They're not sort of individual risks or individual failures, but it's, you know, a harmful practice of detention that we really need, that, you know, is helpfully understood and unpacked as being structural and systemic. And just lastly, just to end on the point about, you know, being mindful of how reforms come about, what kind of work that they do. And some of my own research, you know, I've been particularly interested in, you know, how this idea of vulnerability can pit migrant groups against each other, in particular people that have criminal records that are facing deportation or detention in relation to being criminalized. They're often pitted against, you know, so-called genuine refugees, or people that have maybe less problematic kind of backgrounds, you know, problematic as understood by the state. So it's important to think through that. I think to really sort of challenge detention and not reproduce it as being okay for certain groups of people. So that is it. Thank you, everyone. Please feel free to reach out if you know, offline, if you have any questions or feedback. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. You're in Canada. I imagine it's quite late there at the moment.
almost 9 p.m. It's not bad.
Not too bad.
Not too bad. Thank you.
I'm
Could be
kind of,
worse.
working across countries. Sometimes you can, be meeting at 2 a.m., which, my brain shuts down. So at that point, thank you. That paper is really kind of interesting. I think kind of like in Australia, there's, unfortunately, I guess the model of immigration detention has been kind of piloted and shaped and exported from here. I think it was a Labor government that sort of first brought in detention of asylum seekers and refugees, and then ramped up by the Howard government, and then sort of promoted heavily overseas. So it's really sort of important work that you're doing. But does anybody have any questions for Sarah?
Anyone else wants to go to the phone?
Thank you, Sarah. That was really awesome. And I think that the work that you're doing is super important, especially like teasing out, like what kind of abolitionist steps exist with reform in terms of reducing the PIC as compared to reformist reforms. I think that work is so important because it's at the moment, I think, quite simplified and unclear what the differences are between those two. So I love what you're doing. The thing that I wanted to ask you about is maybe two things. The first thing is the choice to use the word detention. I know that Palestinian formerly incarcerated people, I've read some of their stuff that prefer the word detention because of the focus on the fact that there's no trial. It's not like prison. That's what they've said. But then, we have folks like Behrouz Bouchani, for example, who refers to his experience as a prison experience. And as well, myself, I was in remand. So that's called pretrial detention here, but I call it incarceration. And I just wanted to hear your perspective on the choice that you made with that terminology. And then if you have time as well, on Turtle Island, there's a history of the way that borders and the control of Indigenous people's movements, and a lot of these, things that you're talking about, they're situated in liberal laws that were designed for the purpose of the criminalization of First Nations people. And I was just wondering as well if there's scope in your research to look at the ways that that criminalization of race is a continuation from colonization, and how it's been then imported onto other racialized groups. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much for the questions. Yeah, I kind of go back and forth. So using the term detention as, that's what the state is doing. People are, detained against their against their will. I try to generally use the term people who are detained rather than detainees, but I have not been kind of consistent in this. So yeah, I'm not sure, if there's other suggestions about the different terminology that could be better used. I tend to call it detention. I tend to refer to them as detention centers, not like the UK is, they were detention centers. They renamed them like removal centers to try to, focus on I guess the optics that people are like headed for deportation or something. Canada uses the term holding centers, just to be held. I'm not sure. So I tend to go with the term detention, but I've not been detained myself. So I'd be happy to chat further, or just think about the language of, that I could use it. You could use a better term. And in relation to your second question, definitely part of the work for that project is really trying to bring in intersectional analysis that tries to, account for, the process of reform, the degree to which, it's linked to other processes of reform, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada, more work done around the bodies of children that have been found at residential schools, trying to situate it, in the broader scope of reform efforts that are sort of trying to address colonialism and ongoing colonialism in Canada. Part of the challenge is that, at least in Canada, there's very little data on who is actually being detained. So one of the, and I've written about this in a chapter drawing on Murakami's work about, liberal reformism and willful ignorance. So where, there's no stats on race, but it's just so central to the process that enables detention, that makes it a response to, irregular migration or criminal histories. So part of the work is doing that, and definitely in the UK, I've been thinking more about the centrality of empire and colonialism to detention. It's very clear there how British Empire relates to patterns of migration, and then who ends up being detained. And then Brexit, in terms of racialization of Eastern Europeans and, the kind of end of free movement. There are those important kind of both histories and presents that are, I think, central to the analysis. Hopefully that answers your question somewhat, but feel free to get in touch if you want a better answer.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? I guess across the three presentations today, that there's reform and there's sort of this, I guess, this problematization of kind of this idea of community. Being in community is supposed to be, more free, but then through careless or non-caring acts, people can be quite restricted. This idea that people in, the carceral system extends out into the community. And I think in the with the immigration detention as well, like I'm not sure if it's the same in Canada or the UK, but in Australia, like often, there's different visa classes for people, for asylum seekers, so they can be in community, but they may not have work rights, they may not have access, which is a kind of highly kind of restrictive kind of act. So this idea that I guess the limits of community, of being in community, we have to sort of really think through some of these sorts of things. But I think it's 1 o'clock. Does anyone else have any burning questions or reflections that they'd like to offer? I'd like to thank everyone for, and particularly the three presenters today. I think, I guess people can follow up with one another via kind of the conference website. But thank you.